Hi, everybody. My name is Diego. I am the program manager of file development here at LAMDL. And in this video, we're going to go over what topicality is as an argument in debate. So we're going to go over the negative side first, and then after that, we're going to talk about how to answer topicality on the affirmative side. Hopefully, what you're noticing here is that in every single file we give you all, it comes with a thing called debate primer at the beginning. That tells you the basics of policy debate, and then it also gives you a specific primer on what this specific off case is about. So hopefully you've been checking it out. We're going to use that to go over what this file means, and some tips and pieces of advice that I have for you on how you can argue this beyond just the 1NC and the two AC shells that are inside this file. So first, let's go over what topicality is. Uh, Before we talk about topicality, it's very different than other debate arguments, whereas you have a disad, a counterplan, case arguments that say on the negative side that the affirmative is this bad idea and we should just not pass this policy that the affirmative is proposing. Topicality argues against the affirmative from a different angle, and it's more so about the rules of debate and what words mean in the resolution. So something you have to remember is that anytime you step inside a debate round, at the end of the day, you're playing a game. You know, this game has speech times, it has rules we need to follow, such as, speech times to follow, prep time, what is allowed and not allowed to say in a debate. Like all these things are evidence of the fact that debate is a game. We all come into this activity to win and lose, all these things, right? And like any other game, it has rules such as the speech times I just mentioned, and always deciding a winner and a loser. What you choose to talk about, though, is a bit of a gray area instead of a rule that is set in stone. So, whereas we just define what rules are, topicality is a question about norms in debate and what is allowed to be talked about. So, let's start off by looking at what's highlighted here, which is the resolution. The resolution for this year 25-26 season is resolved. The United States federal government should significantly increase its development and or exploration of the Arctic. This is a topic that is decided by a committee every single point of a certain year. I believe it's like around the beginning of each year. This topic was decided in advance, and it makes the statement that anytime you go inside a policy debate throughout the season, you should be hearing arguments made about the Arctic. Specifically on the affirmative side, you should be hearing arguments that say the US federal government should significantly increase its development and or exploration of the Arctic in some way or the other. We know that for the LAMDL files, it is to increase deep sea mining, but that can look like many different variations of what it means to develop and explore the Arctic, right? Um, let's approach this through a different lens, right? One where what the affirmative says is not set in stone, and we're trying to predict what the affirmative is going to say. If an affirmative team got up and started talking about changes to like federal education policy, would you say that that is about the resolution, about this part that's highlighted in yellow? You would probably say that it's not, and that therefore there should be some consequences assigned because it's not talking about the topic at all. This is a clear example of affirmatives not being topical, but in reality, most affirmatives exist in the gray area of being topical or not, right? There's going to be affirmatives that like only increase or develop or increase its development of the Arctic in a very specific part of the Arctic, such as a specific island, or maybe it only focuses on a specific glacier. Maybe it only wants to explore the Arctic to like a very small extent. All of these types of affirmatives, although they sound like they're on topic, it could produce some bad consequences for the negative in how we prepare against those affirmatives. And so topicality, you should think about it as drawing a line in the sand about what is allowed to be talked about in debate and what isn't. All right. Topicality is always a debate about what the words in the resolution mean. So, like, for example, it's easy to know what the US federal government means. It means that every single time you're affirmative, you are expected to read a policy affirmative that has the United States federal government affirm something. If you got up and said that maybe this corporation like ExxonMobil or Chevron or like another oil like or gas-driven company should do something in the Arctic, not topical. You are affirming an agent that is not a part of the resolution. That is not a part of the resolution. Um, while that's pretty easy to identify, it is not that easy to define things like what significantly increased development and or exploration means, right? These words are left vague on purpose to allow debaters to decide the boundaries of what being topical is. And so most debates about topicality, at least on this topic, are going to be centered around what these words mean. What if increased development means you have to like materially and concretely put a new technology in the Arctic? What if increased development means you have to develop only the environment in some way? These are the questions that Topicality generally tries to answer, and it does so through a very specific set of arguments. So, a topicality show in the one and C is pretty short. I've only ever seen debaters take about maybe like 30 seconds to say it in the one and C. And because it takes so little time for the negative, but a more significant time for the affirmative to answer it in the 2AC, topicality becomes a very strategic option for the negative, not only just in terms of the argument itself, but even if you don't plan on going for topicality, it could very well serve as a time skew. So, let's go over the topicality show. What is a 1 and C going to look like? Regardless of the topic, regardless of the season, what is a 1 and C show going to look like for topicality? The first part is going to be interpretation. So you're going to see a card that says interpretation, this word in the resolution means this. This is you drawing the line in the sand about what development or what like a certain word in the resolution means. In terms of this of the Lambda 5 for this season, it is an interpretation about the words development and exploration. So, for context, the affirmative says we should increase deep sea mining in the Arctic. The negative here is saying interpretation, develop, and exploration only means activities that support the extraction of oil and natural gas, which includes drilling and geophysical surveys. We have a card here that supports this definition, and something you're going to notice is that these definitions have an intent to define. What I mean by that is it literally says, here's what this word means. If you look at this specific portion of the card, it says development means those activities, and then it defines what those words mean. Even here, exploration means we have an intent to define. The more cards that have an intent to define in a topicality argument, the better, because it shows that your card is designated with a purpose to define what these words mean. If it doesn't, and they're just mentioning the words in passing, then that card is pretty weak and doesn't serve as a topicality piece of evidence. So that's the first part for the negative shell. What is your definition for what a certain word means? Once you read that definition, now the topicality argument starts being generated. So the second part to an interpretation, or the second part to a topicality shell is the violation. Now that the negative has established what this word means, your violation has to prove that something about the affirmative has violated your definition, which means they are outside the bounds of being topical. It means that the affirmative, even though like the plan might be a good idea, it doesn't matter. The fact is the affirmative is not about the resolution, and therefore the negative should not be expected to answer this affirmative at all. If they're not topical, they lose the entire debate because they have introduced something that is not about the resolution. So let's look at the violation for this shell. Remember, the affirmative is about deep sea mining that is not oil or natural gas. We have an interpretation by the negative that says development only means extraction of oil and natural gas. Therefore, the violation is the affirmative supports deep sea mining for critical minerals, which is not natural gas or oil. Cool. We've established how the affirmative does not meet this interpretation that the negative just read. What comes next? Uh, what comes next are standards. Standards are reasons you think the affirmative not being topical is a reason they should lose. Uh, them not being topical possibly means, for example, like if you are not talking about things that we cannot expect to be part of the topic, it means that the affirmative is not predictable. In that world, that means that the negative probably has zero ground to debate the affirmative with. What I mean by ground is think of all the arguments you get in a file. You probably get a disadvantage, you get a case negative, you get counter plans. You don't get any of those arguments except for topicality. Um, that sounds like it sets the negative up for failure because there's no world where you should be loading up an entire one and C that is just topicality cards. That's just like it doesn't serve any benefit. Like we're here to learn about the topic. We're not here to like debate about what counts in the resolution and what doesn't. So the argument by the negative usually goes because of these standards, because of these reasons why we think the affirmative being untopical is bad. If we let the affirmative always get away with this, it would lead to unfair debates or uneducational debates, since no meaningful debates can happen if the affirmative is always out of the bounds of the resolution. So, standards for the negative here are first, limits. When you hear the word limits in a topicality debate, just think of like we have a cutoff point as to what is considered topical and what isn't. So, for example, if the interpretation is development only means oil and natural gas, that means affirmatives can only talk about oil and natural gas. That is the limit. The moment you talk about anything else such as deep sea minerals, you're going over that limit. You've crossed it. You've crossed that limit. According to the negative, because of this violation, the affirmative explodes limits, allowing tiny affirmatives that can base their entire arguments around one critical mineral. So just for sake of general knowledge, there's about like 30 or almost 30 critical minerals that exist. That means that according to the negative, an affirmative that talks about deep sea minerals, if allowed under this current resolution, would explode the topic to be about 30 different affirmatives. Under the negatives interpretation, where development only means oil and natural gas, it's only two affirmatives to prepare against. That's a lot more predictable for the negative than 30. So, with that in mind, the negative argues that this makes the topic unpredictable and ruins research for the negative. All right, we have a reason why being untopical is bad. First one is about limits. Second one is about ground. So, ground is about what types of arguments the negative has. So, we know in this topic, in the Arctic, we know that in the LAMDL files, the debaters get access to things like an oil disad or China soft power disad, etc. So, ground says the negative would lose access to oil disads. So that makes sense, right? Because the interpretation says development means only oil and natural gas. If the affirmative is not about oil and natural gas, then you're going to lose access to some disad that relates to oil. Let's continue with it. The negative would lose access to grounds such as oil disads and counterplans that argue deep sea mining is better than oil and gas drilling, making it impossible to be negative. So here the negative is saying that actually this affirmative is a negative argument. This is a counterplan that could exist under the negative's interpretation. So it's saying that it's stealing ground from the negative. Third is topic education. This one, to be honest, is not really seen. It's not really common in topicality debates, but it is one that still exists. Topic education just says that the education that the areas of the topic that the affirmative does not talk about are really important, and failing to talk about them is a bad thing. So this one says fossil fuels are the primary source of energy for the US. And remember, the negatives interpretation for development would only allow discussions about fossil fuels. So they say that fossil fuels are the primary source of energy for the US. Removing our ability to talk about it hurts us as scholars, which makes us unequipped to advocate for real world solutions. So this one is branching out. It's explaining a real world impact to not being informed about the topic in the way the negative wants. It says that we are not able to learn about the primary source of energy that runs the US. That is bad because it makes us unequipped to advocate for real world solutions. Cool. So those are standards. There are many more that exist. I'll go over some in a little bit, but hopefully you're getting a picture of here's how the negative argues why the affirmative being untopical is a bad thing to happen. Okay, last part we need to do is tie it all together. Why do these things matter in the first place? So according to the negative, there are impacts to these standards. Let's take a look. Okay, four, impact. Unfairness is bad in debate. Just think about it like if a game was unfair, if debate as a game was unfair, and we knew that the affirmative was allowed to say whatever they want, they're allowed to be untopical. That gives a really competitive edge to the affirmative where they can just say whatever they want and the negative is always left unprepared in every single debate. Let's take that to its furthest extreme. If you're playing a losing game where you know that every single time you're affirmative, you're going to win, and every single time you're negative, you're going to lose, it takes the fun out of the debate because the whole point is that, you have an equal ground to debate on, and there's a 50-50 chance on most occasions that you're either going to win or lose the debate as long as like the skill between both sides is equal. If it's not equal and debate turns into a really unfair game, usually people argue that it's like at its most extreme case, it would cause people to like quit, participation rates decline, and it means debates are always one-sided. If we value fairness, if we value the ability for two sides to clash about a certain issue, then we should prioritize fairness as an impact in and of itself, is usually what people say. Second impact, again, it's not really seen, but sometimes it's a thing, is education. Not learning about the resolution in the way the negative wants is bad because knowledge about the Arctic is good for some real life portable skill. Think of portable skills such as the ability to research, the ability to clash over certain ideas. Anytime the negative makes, or anytime the affirmative makes the topic unpredictable to engage in, anytime the affirmative reduces the amount of the ground that the negative might have, that could result in poorer quality of debates, which is bad for fairness and bad for the education that people take away from the round. So that is the full shell for the negative in terms of the one and C when arguing topicality. Like I said, there are many other different types of standards that you can explore, arguing and practice arguing as well. We've already went over ground. So ground refers to the types of arguments read in debate by the negative usually. So arguments like disadvantages and counterplans. When the negative team claims that they have a loss of ground, that they have experienced a loss of ground, it means that the AF being untopical results in the negative being unable to read the disads and counterplans that they have prepared. Second argument is predictability. So this standard says uh, if the negative can predict this affirmative to be ran as a topic under the resolution, then the negative would always be 5 steps behind, right? We go into debates thinking that if a team reads this argument, we can have these arguments to read against the other side. If the other team reads the deep sea mining app, we know we have the China soft power decide. If we know that the team is reading an Alaskan oil affirmative that bans Alaskan oil, we know that we have the oil decide. Like the ability to predict arguments on the negative side is crucial for you to be successful on the negative side. Anytime the affirmative takes away that predictability, the argument is that that diminishes the ability fairness as an impact in debate. Okay, third one is limits. We went over this one as well. If we were to allow this specific app to be considered topical, the argument is that it opens the floodgates for millions of new affirmatives to be considered topical as well. Limits are a question of what can and can't be read under the resolution. A tighter limit equals less affirmatives and therefore less negative preparation to do. But a broader limit equals a lot more affirmatives, which means more things the negative has to prepare for. Last one that I'll cover here in terms of standards, or my bad, we'll go over more. Next one is framers intent. Not really heard of now, but it used to be a thing back then. Is framers intent. This argument is just like the topic committee wanted us to debate the resolution in this specific manner, therefore we should. Again, nobody really does this anymore. Like topicality is a debate that should be left for the debaters to decide. This is a really weak argument. The other way I've seen framers intent as well is based on definitions. So, for example, if we go to this negative interpretation evidence right here, this interpretation for development and exploration is written by the Code of Federal Regulations, and and this comes from the Department of the Interior, and the topic is about environmental enforcement. Framers intent standard would sound like this is how the government would have wanted us to approach this debate, and therefore we should approach it that way. That is one standard that the negative can do, but again, I don't really see it used too often because most of the time the affirmative has definitions from like sources of the same credibility, and so it usually doesn't become a thing unless like the sources from each definition are really lopsided. Okay. Next standard to talk about is legal precision. Again, this is similar to framers intent, but again, it's slightly different. Legal precision argues that your interpretation should be preferred over the opponent's because it is backed by more scholarly articles. So again, maybe as the affirmative or the negative team, you're noticing an imbalance in terms of whose authors are more credible in a topicality debate. You would then compare which ones should be prioritized over the other, and oftentimes it comes down to the question of which one is more attuned to the law, which one is more attuned to policymaking, and that is why this standard is titled legal precision. Six is reasonability. This is an argument not for the negative side, but for the affirmative side exclusively. Reasonability is a standard used by the affirmative that says even if the negative is right, that we are untopical, or that the affirmative's new interpretation for what a certain word means is not as good as the negative's interpretation, the affirmative is still reasonably predictable and provides the neg reasonably fair ground to debate for the resolution. If you're asking yourself, what does reasonability mean then? Like, is there a strict metric to quantify it? There isn't. It relies on you, it relies on you to bank on the judge's intuition that the affirmative can reasonably be a part of the topic. So, for example, this development interpretation from the negative that says when we're talking about the Arctic, we can only talk about oil and natural gas seems over limiting. Like, yes, we care about limits to an extent, but this one seems like it's like limiting the resolution to a very strict amount. So much to the point that if we limit the topic to be only about two different types of affirmatives, oil and natural gas, that would probably make debates very boring. And at some point, it's like too much of one thing can be a bad thing. And so the argument by the affirmative would be, even if you think that yes, this interpretation does have a more limited approach to the resolution. An affirmative that talks about deep sea mining is still reasonably predictable. It's still reasonably fair to debate about because in 2026, like deep sea mining, critical minerals, they're all the rage now. Like it's topic relevant, it's timely, etc. So that is one way that the affirmative can use reasonability. It allows the affirmative to say that even if we're behind on the topicality debate, it's still like the affirmative is still a debatable argument. It's still a debatable affirmative. Okay. We went over the negative side. Let's talk about the affirmative side now. So there are different ways you can respond to it, but again, like the 1 and C following a specific order, the 2AC also follows a specific order, and I hope you notice that when you're going through these files. The first part that the affirmative does when answering topicality is a we meet argument. A we meet argument just says, hey, look, the negative has read this definition that they think we violate. We actually fall under their own definition. So the negative's interpretation about development is talking about extraction activities. This affirmative would say, we meet, the plan supports drilling for deep sea minerals, which is what their 1 and C evidence mandates all plans to do. Now, we know that the card is about oil and natural gas, but part of their definition says that it has to be extraction related activities. Drilling for deep sea minerals is an extraction related activity. So this we meet argument is saying that it's like there are portions of the evidence that we do meet. If the affirmative wins, that they meet the interpretation of the negative, game over. Like the affirmative is one that they're topical. So most affirmatives start off with a we meet argument, even if it is a very weak we meet argument. Like even if like it only takes a couple seconds to break down why a we meet argument may not make logical sense, you always make it just in case the negative undercovers the we meet argument, or there's a chance that the judge is convinced by it. Okay. Second argument that the affirmative makes is a counter interpretation. Counter interpretation kind of just sounds like what you think it might mean. The negative argues an interpretation of a specific word. The affirmative introduces a counter definition of that word. So right here, this debate is about the word development in the resolution. The affirmative says counter interpretation. Development includes infrastructural development, which includes minerals. Okay. So the affirmative is reading a definition that can now encompass their affirmative as well. Very important you do that because if there's any chance that you do not meet your own interpretation, you have cooked yourself like twice. You know, the negative has said you don't meet our interpretation. If the AF meets, if the AF reads a piece of evidence that they don't match, then like it's just over. Like you have zero resolutional basis at that point. When the affirmative introduces a counter-interpretation, now that sets up the debate to be about which definition is better. So as the affirmative, you need to have reasons why your definition is better after you introduce your counter-interpretation. The way you do that is explain standards that align with your interpretation better than the negatives. So you want to explain that your interpretation creates a better form of debate. So you can argue that your interpretation has better limits, it has better ground. So like usually the negative will always have the more limiting interpretation. The affirmative usually has interpretations that expand the topic by a little bit to allow the affirmative to exist, right? And so because of that, the argument that the affirmative usually has to make is the negative over limits the topic, like they make too narrow of the debate for the entire season, and that results in boring debates. But also, if we expand the topic through this counter-interpretation, if we allow, for example, the deep sea mining out to occur, the negative gets better ground. It's no longer the oil decide, you also get the China soft power decide. It's no longer just this specific argument that the negative gets. The negative can get these arguments as well. It's usually preferable for the affirmative to give a case list. What I mean by that is examples of different types of affirmatives that can be read under their model, and then also different types of negative arguments that can be read as well. The more you do that, you're painting a picture for the judge as to why your model debate is preferable than the negatives. And again, this is all spawning from a specific interpretation of what words mean. Why is your interpretation better is what the affirmative needs to prove. Okay. After you are done explaining why the counter-interpretation is better for debate, you have to give defense against the negatives arguments. Here, the negatives' main arguments is the affirmative ruins limits, ruins predictability, ruins ground, etc. So as the affirmative, you have to defend against those claims. There are three types of defense that I usually see. The first one is you can say that the negative standards are overblown and not as big of a deal as they think they are. So for example, limits, whereas the negative says that they set a limit on the topic, the affirmative can argue that you overlimit, that the negative overlimits what is allowed on the topic through their interpretation. Second, you can argue that the counter-interpretation is better for debate. That's more gearing along the lines of offense, but you can also say that their model debate is bad as well. Not just for like overlimiting, but also for like the types of arguments that the negative gets. Maybe under the negatives model, the negative is more lopsided than the affirmative, right? The negative is complaining a lot about the fact that under the affirmative's vision for the topic, like affirmatives would like be really unfair. It would be an uphill battle for the negative, but the inverse could be true of that as well with the negative's interpretation. The negative could very easily be a self-interested actor saying their own interpretation because they want to win negative debates 100% of the time. So you have to make arguments against their interpretation as well. The third argument is reasonability as a form of defense. We already went over this previously. Even if the negative arguments are true that you aren't 100% topical or that you might like expand limits by a little too much, the app is still reasonably predictable, which means there is still a very small impact to their topicality arguments. With that being said, hopefully that gives you a better picture of how to understand the topicality file, and good luck debating it.